I'd like to live forever, she muses, the words playful on wicked lips. She's there, before him, her soul endless, confined by a limited physical being. Her eyes, though, they hold no fear, like she's inviting a challenge from the devil himself, waiting for someone to tell her it's impossible to live forever, that her statement was pointless. Oh, that poor naive girl. Eternal, she burns in her own fragility, knowing an aura is an artwork that shall never fade. For words echo in silent nights, shadows wander lonely halls to witness their legacy, whisper their stories. She shrugs away her wine-drunk thoughts. I'd like to live forever, but I won't. This is Mirrors, a collection of horrors, history, and hauntings. I'm your host, Gabby. In November, I did a road trip through New England to visit a few of its many haunted locations, all while learning how to deepen my communication with spirit. And now, as I reflect on my trip, I'm bringing you along with me. Today, we'll be discussing two people who I've brought up quite a bit on the podcast before, Ed and Lorraine Warren. I've mentioned glimpses into their stories and their involvement in the hauntings we've covered, such as the Farnsworth House, the Annabelle doll, and the Union Cemetery. But in expanding upon the paranormal history of New England, I wanted to offer a more well-rounded view into who the Warrens were and how they shaped this community. While in Connecticut, I visited Stepney Cemetery, where Ed and Lorraine are buried. Being in Monroe, where they were based, and where their museum of haunted and cursed objects still is, I felt very connected to them as critical figures of the paranormal. There has been extensive conversations about the couple, including controversy around them and the validity of their investigations. But it goes without saying that their theories have been the basis for how many modern paranormal explorers approach their own investigations. Their careers also inspired my favorite horror film series, The Conjuring Universe. So, let's go back to the very beginning. Ed and Lorraine both grew up in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Both of their families closely aligned with the Catholic faith, which would eventually lay a foundation for how they approached the paranormal. Ed's childhood home was allegedly quite haunted, with doors opening inexplicably and strange lights forming and disappearing. Meanwhile, as a child, Lorraine was beginning to understand her psychic abilities. She recalled once seeing an angel in a hospital, which no one really believed at the time. She'd also been able to see auras as glowing, vivid colors reflecting a person's energy, mood, and health. This started at just 9 years old, and Lorraine really thought it was normal. One day at Catholic school, Lorraine casually told one of the nuns that her aura was glowing brighter than the Mother Superior's, which was quickly dismissed, the nuns warning her against speaking of such things. This made her realize that maybe what she was experiencing was unusual, and made her hesitant to talk about it any further. Over time, as she learned about and honed her abilities, it was clear that this was more of a divine gift. As teenagers, Ed and Lorraine met at the Colonial Theater, where Ed was working as an usher. In 1944, at just 17, Ed enlisted in the Navy and went off to serve in World War II, although they kept in touch via letters. A year later, while Ed was home on leave, he and Lorraine got married. The pair undoubtedly connected over their shared interest in the paranormal, and just a few years later, in 1952, they established NESPR, or the New England Society for Psychic Research. Something I, as a writer, find fascinating about the Warrens is the bridge they formed in their own practice between creativity and the paranormal. Obviously, this is because of how their stories have played such a huge role in the horror film space. But art was also critical in the Warrens' early careers. Ed went to Perry Art School, the arts subsidiary of Yale, although he withdrew after 2 years to sell his work, most of which centered around the paranormal. He and Lorraine would research supposedly haunted homes in the area, and Ed would paint them. They'd then take the paintings to the homeowners, using it to spark a conversation with them and open the door to get inside and do an investigation. This allowed them to get exposure to the paranormal and establish themselves in the community as investigators. Ed was a self taught demonologist, the only non ordained demonologist recognized by the Catholic Church. Lorraine was a light trance medium, meaning she could enter a trance like state in which she would remain partially aware of her surroundings while receiving messages from spirit, being in kind of an in between space. As a pair, Ed grounded each case in a practical, investigative approach, while Lorraine used her intuition and empathetic nature to understand the emotional complexities of each haunting. They would go on to investigate over 100 cases, collecting evidence and artifacts from each location, while building a dialogue around the paranormal. The Nesper website describes the Warrens, saying, "They were not strange. If you had the privilege of speaking with them, they would seem like normal folks with regular jobs. They were ordinary people who happened to do extraordinary work in a field that most people fear or don't believe." That seems to be the Warrens' legacy, encouraging openness to the paranormal from an educational and creative standpoint, sparking worldwide interest in the cases they worked on. I loved learning about their early interactions with haunted places and that journey of learning about themselves and each other through their work. But, of course, the Warrens are known primarily for their involvement in high profile investigations, and we'll be talking about them through the lens of two of those, both of which inspired films in the Conjuring Universe: The Conjuring House and The Devil Made Me Do It case. The Conjuring House, as it has come to be known as, is undoubtedly the most famous haunted location in New England. And it was actually announced recently that it will be closed to the public indefinitely. There has been a lot of drama and controversy surrounding the house, its owner, and its paranormal claims over the last year or so, and I'm not going to touch that. If you're interested, feel free to look into it. But if you're involved in the paranormal community, I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. Side note, it was kind of funny, like being in New England as a lot of these things were happening. Um, just like if I would mention it casually, you'd just see this like collective eye roll. But anyway, there's a lot of uncertainty about what the future of the Conjuring House looks like, which is pretty devastating. I've watched so many investigations at the house that I've always been curious to go there for myself. I still wanted to talk about it here, not just because it's such a huge part of the Warrens' career and legacy, but also because I couldn't discuss New England hauntings without talking about the Conjuring House. The house has a fascinating, although questionable, history, and that's what we're going to focus on. And although the film derails from the true story of this house, The Conjuring is one of my favorite horror movies. In fact, it's the one that really got me into writing horror for myself. In January 1971, Roger and Carolyn Perrin moved into a farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island, with their 5 daughters: Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cindy, and April. While it is now known as the Conjuring House, the more historically accurate name is the Old Arnold Estate. Almost immediately, the family began experiencing unexplainable things, starting with a sighting of a detailed, full bodied apparition while the family was moving boxes into the house. Beyond that, the activity started slowly and seemed more innocent. Brooms moved on their own, or strange piles of dirt would appear in the middle of the floors that were just cleaned. It's important to note, the film shows everything happening really quickly, But the Perrin family lived there for 10 years. Some days things happened, some days they didn't. And there was a wide variety of activity, as well as the spirits that came through. Andrea Perrin, the eldest Perrin daughter, has since extensively documented her family's experience of living there for a decade. And she has a deep love for the house, acknowledging that while it was scary at times, many spirits were actually quite protective and kind. But being in it, having these things happen unexpectedly in the place meant to be a safe haven, a home, was terrifying. And over time, everything became more frequent and far more intense, seemingly targeting Carolyn Perrin, the family's matriarch. Carolyn and the girls smelled what they equated with rotting flesh, believed to be a sign of a demonic presence. Carolyn even claims to have been physically touched and hurt by unseen forces. Cindy Perrin had spirits surround her in the night, whispering, "There are 7 dead soldiers buried in the wall." Roger Perrin traveled for work and was not as exposed to the activity in the home, making him quite dismissive of his family's claims. He also said later in life that he was hesitant to believe this because he hated to think he put his family in any sort of danger. In an interview with the Two Girls, One Ghost podcast, Andrea said her father's denial did impact the dynamics of her family, and she was often left to carry the emotional weight of her family's experience, as her sisters would tell her about what happened rather than their mother. Apparently, the farmhouse had quite the reputation in town. A group of investigators had been to the home and told the Warrens about it. The Perrin family had no clue who the Warrens were when they showed up to the house in 1974, which is different than how the movie presents the history. "I knew the house was haunted. All I had to do was walk in," Lorraine said in an interview. Now we look to the night of the seance, which is depicted in the movie as more of a full-blown exorcism. However, Andrea still claims that the reality of that night was scarier than anything Hollywood could have dreamt up. Ed and Lorraine conducted the seance to figure out which spirits were causing such destruction to the family. Allegedly, Carolyn was possessed. Andrea watched the scene unfold before her very eyes. "I thought I was going to pass out. My mother began to speak a language not of this world in a voice not her own. Her chair levitated and she was thrown across the room." After this, Roger actually kicked the Warrens out of the house. The family continued experiencing activity until 1980, when they moved out. Financial constraints kept them there for that time, but once moving out, Carolyn said she didn't think she would have survived another winter in the house. So, did the Warrens ever figure out what was haunting this historic farmhouse? Well, not exactly. Lorraine Warren placed the blame on a woman named Bathsheba Sherman, who lived near the property in the 1800s and was rumored to be a Satan-worshipping witch, even possibly related to Mary Easty, who was hanged in the Salem witch trials. The Conjuring totally embraces Bathsheba as the malevolent presence of the home, showing her as a horrifying monster who killed her baby with a sewing needle and then killed herself as a sacrifice to the devil, cursing the land forever. But Bathsheba was a real woman whose name has been desecrated because of the film and the Warrens. She was born in Rhode Island in 1912 and lived until age 72, having died of paralysis due to a stroke, according to historical records. She was buried in the Harrisville Cemetery, and fortunately, a new headstone has recently been placed for her, as the original was vandalized in response to the narrative perpetuated by the movie. There's no documentation that she ever lived on the Conjuring House property, although she did live in Harrisville, and there's no historical evidence or court documents that she ever caused anyone harm. Records suggest she did lose a baby, but that doesn't automatically point to murder. Infant mortality rates at this time were incredibly high. Bathsheba was the topic of local gossip and rumors, likely originating these beliefs around her being a witch and practicing dark rituals. She was known as cold and reclusive, and although she did marry Judson Sherman in 1844, she was 32. Gasp. Totally not the societal norm and could have added to the idea that she was an outsider. As we'll see next week discussing the Salem witch trials, women who deviated from societal expectations were feared. Spoiler, we still are. And rumors can be deadly. Andrea Perrin agrees that she doesn't think Bathsheba was the cause of her family's hauntings. And she, too, is sad to see how it has disrupted Bathsheba's rest. Rather, Andrea has described the house as a portal, cleverly disguised as a farmhouse. Like I said, it's believed there were a wide variety of spirits at the home, making it a transient, in-between space. Andrea thinks past residents may haunt the home, but it could be a place for spirits across time and borders. She's even discussed her own experiences seeing UFOs above the farmhouse. So it's unclear what or who really is causing the paranormal activity here. It could just be that this land is one of those rare spots drawing unexplained spiritual energy. Another potential cause of the hauntings call back to last week's episode when we talked about the King Philip's War, a brutal conflict leaving a trail of death and devastation across New England. There's speculation that the Conjuring House sits on land connected to the war, in some way causing residual energy and fueling paranormal activity. In 2019, a group of paranormal investigators decided to explore the idea of bodies being buried on the property. Remember, Cindy Perrin was told there were 7 dead soldiers buried in the walls, potentially referring to the stone wall surrounding the property. The investigators used a ground-penetrating radar to look for anomalies around the wall. And sure enough, 5 irregularities were detected, appearing similar to how a grave would look, because of cost and resource restrictions, as well as respect for the potential graves. They didn't dig or do any further investigation, nor did they locate the potential 2 other bodies of soldiers. But it is really interesting to consider given Cindy's claims, and perhaps these soldiers are a few of the spirits haunting the house. There's also the history of the Arnold family, who built the house and lived in it for over 8 generations. Local historical records do point at a potential suicide on the property. A woman named Susan Arnold hanged herself in the attic of her home in 1866, although it is unclear if this was at the Conjuring House. Andrea Perrin did write about a suicide by hanging in the farmhouse, but refers to a Mrs. Arnold, so it's unclear if this is the same person and the same story as this Susan Arnold. Either way, the home was obviously at the center of the Arnold family for a long time, witnessing life and death, possibly still housing their spirits. The house was at one point used as a daycare, with a child's drawing found in the basement depicting a woman with a broken neck. The spirit of a bent neck lady is referred to in many investigations at the Conjuring House, so perhaps this is what the children were seeing. Point is, there's many different possibilities of what actually haunts this home, which is only further complicated in the blurring of fact and fiction, as well as recent controversies calling the home into question altogether. My main takeaway is that those who truly love and honor the history of this land see the old Arnold estate as a place of spirituality and thriving paranormal activity. Now for the Devil Made Me Do It case, the first known court case in which defendant Arnie Johnson sought to prove his innocence on the basis that he was possessed by a demon. I was actually able to meet Arnie Johnson a few years ago at my first Warren's Paracon in Connecticut. He also did a panel, and it was so interesting to actually hear him tell his story in person. In 1981, a 19-year-old named Arnie Johnson was put on trial for first-degree manslaughter. In February of that year, he joined his girlfriend Debbie at the dog kennel she worked at, along with Debbie's manager, Alan Bono, who also happened to be the couple's landlord. They all went out to lunch at a local bar, returning back to the kennel quite intoxicated. In his drunkenness, Alan became agitated, leading to an altercation between him and Arnie, in which Debbie stood between them. Arnie reportedly started growling like an animal as he pulled out a pocket knife, lunging at Alan and stabbing him. Alan died a few hours later from the 4 to 5 chest wounds he endured, the worst being one that stretched from his stomach to the base of his heart. Arnie was taken into custody by police 2 miles from the murder, wandering the streets covered in blood. In the police car, he blamed his, quote, drinking problem. However, when the Warrens were notified of the murder, they immediately turned to the possibility of demonic possession. You see, the Warrens had been working with Arnie and Debbie already, helping Debbie's 11-year-old brother, David Gleitzel, who they believed to be possessed. David was being haunted by an entity. This is how he recently described the presence in the Netflix documentary The Devil on Trial. It looked like the devil in a Halloween costume. His eyes were black, solid black, just like a chunk of coal, and it scared me. David claimed the entity would physically harm him, and he began showing unusual behavior, growling and speaking in tongues. This led the family to contacting the Warrens, who got the Catholic Church involved and scheduled an exorcism. The exorcism would end up lasting days, the family watching on as David contorted unnaturally, exhibiting seemingly inhuman strength, and speaking languages he had no way of knowing. In a particularly intense moment, Arnie made a mistake that would prove to be fatal. He yelled, "Leave this little kid alone. Take me on." "What did you do?" Lorraine asked Arnie. Not long after, Arnie began having totally uncharacteristic fits of rage and aggression, in which he claimed to see the entity David saw. And 5 months after the exorcism, the murder of Alan Bono took place. During the panel, Arnie swore up and down that he had no recollection of the murder, feeling overtaken by a dark force. Tony Spera, the Warrens' son-in-law, sat beside him, sharing the same message the Warrens did: never challenge the devil. Ed and Lorraine Warren believed Arnie was possessed, David's entity having transferred to him on that fateful night of the exorcism. Arnie spoke so gently and was very kind when I met him. Not that that means anything, but is certainly worth noting. Lawyer Martin Minella bravely defended Arnie, believing wholeheartedly in his innocence, taking the stand and claiming his innocence on the basis of demonic possession. This landmark claim made headlines around the world, although it was eventually dismissed by the judge based on the lack of physical, scientific evidence available. After all, a man was still dead, and Arnie technically had the blood on his hands. So they shifted their argument to self-defense, and Arnie was convicted of manslaughter, sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. Although he was released after 5 years on good behavior, he and Debbie had gotten married while he was in jail, and Arnie has since continued sharing his experiences in the media and alongside the Warrens. I'd say this case is probably one of the Warrens' most controversial because, like I said, a man still died. Members of David Gleitzel's family have also come forward saying they felt the case was sensationalized and they were used by the Warrens for fame and financial gain. They see very real, severe mental health struggles at the core of what David was experiencing. David's older brother Carl has even publicly said that he believes the murder has absolutely nothing to do with David. There were rumors of an affair between Debbie and Alan Bono, and Arnie was, quote, very possessive of Debbie. David himself has come forward to share how little his family has benefited financially from the media created about them, particularly the 1983 book, The Devil in Connecticut. Meanwhile, the Warrens took most of the profit. I think this is a very valid and relevant part of the story, leaning into the primary criticism of the Warrens. Their cases, especially the ones that made them famous, have been seen as exaggerated. And of course, the Conjuring films dramatize quite a bit, bringing in fictional elements and amping up the stakes. Some cases are seen as fiction altogether, such as the Amityville Horror House, widely accepted as a total hoax. But to be the devil's advocate, literally, this case can be seen as an example of the Warrens' sensitivity and devotion to their work. They took an interest in David Gleitzel and then Arnie and defended them tirelessly, even if it meant tarnishing their name and facing extensive criticism. Claiming demonic possession in court was an incredibly risky thing to do, so we have to at least acknowledge that. Ed passed away in 2006 and Lorraine died in 2019. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, their collection of haunted and cursed objects is still in Monroe, Connecticut, the museum now run by their son-in-law, Tony Spera. The past few years, they've done annual paracons to bring these objects out, allowing more people to see and learn about them. The most recent was in Gettysburg this past September, and it was so cool to see so many paranormal enthusiasts coming together. Again, this remains the Warrens' legacy, offering a space to delve into our own curiosities and explore the unknown. For investigators, I believe the Warrens have inspired people to go into haunted places with respect for the history, spiritual energy, and emotions of each unique location. Also, to incorporate multiple different techniques into an investigation, having a balance between the mystical and practical to capture valid evidence and facilitate effective investigations. I really loved looking more into the details behind these names that we've all heard so many times. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. Next week, we head to Salem. I'll see you there. Until then, stay spooky. This has been Mirrors, Horrors, History, and Hauntings. Produced and hosted by Gabby Hope Fry.